Chapter 9 Nobody's Horse. It wasn't no triumphant nor proud homecoming for Colonel, and like most prodigals, he'd come home to eat, sleep, and find shelter. At the sound of Brad's voice, he'd nickered his gladness, and after him and the other cowboy had picked out some weak stock that had drifted along the fence and started 'em on towards the feed grounds near the ranch. Colonel made sure he didn't lose track of neither of the riders as they worked through the cattle, cut out the weak ones and started 'em on, and he didn't need no leading as he followed them and the cattle through a gate and on towards the ranch. He didn't have much strength, and with drifting on through the storm, with very little feed and only snow to lap up for moisture during the past month or so of cold and snowy weather, more than told on him. But now knowing of what all there would be for him once at the ranch, the thoughts of that is what kept him a-going, following the riders along with the lean and shaggy cattle. Not a very proud-looking procession. There was no sign that Colonel had been running free and amongst wild ones all that summer and fall past. None by his actions at least. Only his looks and condition he was in showed some signs of that. There was the plain scar along the back of his neck, and which was a mark of one of his experiences. There was of course quite a few other scratches and barked, peeled places along his now thin frame, but he was still altogether much the wiser, but with no show of any wild spirit that he was inclined to make any break for freedom, and try to be a wild one again, not for the time anyway. And as the ranch was reached, and he followed Brad into the familiar box stall, was handed the cream of hay, warm water to drink, right in the warmth and shelter of the long log stable, and amongst other horses he didn't even think of his little partner Charo, who at the time was humped up in scanty shelter against the storm, which was howling some more and showed no sign of letting up. It had let up some during the day as Colonel had drifted in with the cattle, but had come in full force again before dark. But Colonel didn't feel any of it, for there was a good thick wall of logs between him and that weather. He ate and drank his fill, then stretched and slept on dry bedding of waste hay, his mouth and muscles sometimes twitching, like maybe dreaming of going over scary places in following Charo and the two renegades. It had been a great spell of wild freedom for Colonel, but Old Man Winter and hunger had put an end to that like nothing else could, and he was glad to get back to human care and comfort. He didn't mind the enclosures, inside walls nor fences, for, like the tame canary, whose home is his cage, he was content and only very helpless outside of such. Without the lead and coaching of Charo, Colonel would have never lived through his spell of that freedom. It wasn't in him to go wild, or ever want to be away from the company of humans, not unless maybe after years of steady wild freedom, and that would have to be sort of forced on him through circumstances. With Charo being of wild blood, his freedom meant much more to him than all the care any human could give him. He'd rather go hungry, thirsty, buck all weather, all and everything at its worst, than to be inside any enclosure and be at the command and dependent of the human. And now, while bumped against the cold wind and storm, scarce feed under deep snow, all a-swirling white and blinding around him, he had no thought nor hankering for the good shelter and care of the winter before, that which had saved his life. He only thought of the enclosures of the time, and that was against his nature. As Colonel was enjoying the comforts of his warm stall, so was Charo bearing well under the hardships of his freedom. The little wild horse had no thought that his long-legged partner had drifted on with the storm and left him. He'd figured him in some shelter close by, and would find him soon as the storm let up, and he could see some distance again. It was impossible while the storm blowed on, and he done well to even see the two older horses, which he'd sheltered within only a few feet of, when the storm hit so sudden. It was still storming hard on the morning after Colonel's return to the ranch, but that blue blood didn't know anything about it until the stable door was swung open and a gust of that cold wind hit him. The door was soon closed, and then he heard a familiar voice, Virginia's. Brad had told her that morning that a hat rack covered over with a horsehide had sneaked in there the night before, and she'd ought to go see about it. She of course knew by Brad's pleased grin at the telling what the hat rack might be, and even though she hadn't had her breakfast as yet, that could wait, and she wasted no time getting down to the stables to find the blinking, lean, and shaggy Colonel. If there ever was any thought in anyone's mind of punishing or scolding a wayward runaway, that was the last thing that could come to Virginia's at her glad surprise of seeing the colt again, and being so thin and weak, looking drawed only deep sympathy. She now only thought more of him for his returning of his own accord, and would be very happy to give him the best of care and put him back in shape. That would give her great pleasure. She was nearly too happy and excited with Colonel's return to take time to come back to the house and eat her breakfast, but not to keep her dad and Anne waiting. She finally rushed back, and then she was calmed down some by her dad asking, "What about Charo?" With her excitement at again seeing Colonel, little Charo hadn't come to her mind. That is, she'd been so surprised and pleased that for the time she couldn't think of anything else but Colonel. But now that she'd been reminded of the little wild colt, it come sudden as to how strange he wasn't along too, for they'd been such close pals and wouldn't separate, nor unless something where one just couldn't follow the other. It would have to be something very serious, she thought. Telling her dad of her fears that way only made him grunt and grin as he waved a hand at such fears. "Don't you worry about that little fuzz tail," he says. "You'll find him bucking high and slick as an eel when that mosquito-built brown wind cutter of yours would be folding up. It's just that he didn't want to come back and be fussed over, and I'll bet he'll do as well right wherever he is as Colonel will in the stable. By the mangerful of the good feed he doesn't have to rustle for." "I hope you're right, Dad," Virginia said, "but I wish he'd returned too. Him and Colonel had so much fun playing together." "Yeah, but I wouldn't worry about him. Besides, some of the boys might run across him any time. I've an idea Colonel was with him and not very far away, or he wouldn't have left him to come back here alone. He's with some bunch along the edge of the valley somewhere and below the deep snow." Cal didn't know how close he'd guessed, but that was it, and from his knowledge and experience with horses, that guess also sounded reasonable to Virginia, and relieved her of much worry about the little wild one. She felt, too, that, as her dad had said, the boys might run across him any time. That happened sooner than was expected. It had stayed stormy and cold for a week after Colonel had returned. Then, as it cleared and got some warmer and the boys got to making bigger circles from the ranching camps, Brad and Red, riding together one day, rode onto 3 horses which had been hard at pawing for their feed on the sunny side of a foothill. It was the 2 renegades and little Charo. Busy pawing as they'd been, the horses didn't see the riders until they'd topped the foothill to within about 50 yards, but at that it wasn't even break, for the riders hadn't seen 'em no sooner, and right then there soon got to be much more distance separating. But at a glance, and while the horses had stood sort of petrified for a split second, Brad and Red had right away recognized little Charo with the other 2, and they, also being as surprised as the horses had been, just sat, held their horses still, and watched the 3 go. Charo now as wild as the other 2. The boys hadn't been prepared for such a surprise, and even though they'd been on the lookout for Charo, they didn't think that him nor any other wild ones would be so close to the ranch, only to within half a day's slow riding, and they'd been more to watch for weak stock amongst the scattered bunches of cattle than they had the horses. As luck would have it, there was no cattle found that needed taking in that day. The weaker ones had been brought in right along until there was no more for the time from that part of the range, and the 2 riders had been about to circle back towards the ranch when they'd run onto Charo. Surprised as they'd been to see him, they wasn't at all surprised to see how wild he'd got. He'd be near as hard to catch as the 2 renegades he was with, but as they sat on their horses and watched the 3 go, they figured that now was the time to get him, while the snow was deep, maybe a little weak, and before he'd get back to the wild horse range. It would be very different in getting him than it had been with Colonel. The thoroughbred had been mighty glad to see the riders and follow them on in, but the little wild one would have to be roped, and being he wasn't broke to lead and wouldn't at all follow, he'd have to be hazed on in at the end of the rope. It was good they'd just held their horses still and let the 3 run on. For one thing, they hadn't been prepared, and another, they wanted 'em to have their first run. They wouldn't go far in the deep snow, and by the right kind of maneuvering, they could soon get to 'em from the right direction and at the right time. Against hardened, grain-fed, and fast-saddle horses of the 2 cowboys, little Charo wouldn't have much chance. The 2 older ones could maybe be caught too, but them wasn't wanted, just little Charo. The riders didn't move their horses until the wild ones got out of sight over another foothill ridge. Then, getting the general direction of their going, they started further up, and above 'em more up towards the mountains, for it was figured there's where they'd hit for soon, as the riders came to sight, and there, with the wild ones crowding to get by during the run, is where the good chance would come to get within roping distance without having to do too much running. It worked out as the riders figured, and they didn't hit out on a high lope to get to point above 'em, for the snow was too deep for one thing, and another was the wild ones wouldn't go very fast either on that account, not very far before they'd stop. The riders didn't have to go much over a couple of miles when they spotted the 3 wild ones again, now going only at a walk, but at the sight of the riders they started to run, some more, and up for the mountains. for the wise old renegades didn't care for the big flat below too much open, and then's when the riders now had the leverage on 'em, for they was already above it. Would take quite a bit of the wild one's wind to get there and past 'em, but they tried it, and there was a lunging run of over a mile, when the riders a ways above the wild ones kept abreast of 'em. Then the wild ones began to crowd to get up in the mountains, and then's when the riders made their loops ready. Little Charo showed signs of being winded some, but he was game and wasn't far behind. There was plenty of strength and speed in the hardened saddle horses of the two riders, and when the right time come, while the wild ones had got into deep drifts to get past and up in the mountains, they spurted their horses on, and after a few seconds of scrambling in the deep snow, Brad's loop settled over Charo's head and around his neck. Red couldn't resist but make a throw at one of the renegades then, but he didn't try very hard, and his loop fell short a couple of feet. He didn't try no more, for Charo was the only one that was wanted, and now, as Brad's loop drawed around his neck, that little feller went against it and squealed like a regular wild one. He didn't want nothing to do with that rope, nor recognize the human that had caught him, and he was all for fighting that hemp that held him. But there was no use of his doing that, and Brad only had to grin some in a way as he let him fight for a spell. "Now, little feller," he says to the wild-eyed Charo, "that ain't no way for you to act, not even if your ma and pa and your great-great-grand ancestors was all wild ones. Do you forget the good treatment you had last winter, and the pretty lady who took care of you and brought you back to life? You ought to be ashamed of yourself." Yes, Red chipped in, also grinning, "and you'd only get caught anyhow, sooner or later, and you wouldn't have the good home we're taking you back to. Then again, you might only get shot in the long run, and be left for the coyotes to clean up." But little Charo couldn't understand, and wasn't in no mood to listen to any talk. The only thing he'd understood and appreciated right then would have been to had that rope slip off his neck, and left to go and join the two renegades, which had gone on to their freedom. The first useless and fighting spasm over, Charo quieted down some. He knew he was licked, and when Brad got off his horse and came towards him, he hardly flinched, for he did remember that only gentle treatment had come from the touch of the human hand. So far, and even though he didn't hanker for any such right, then he seen where he sort of had to resign himself, and be the gentle colt he had the winter before. He didn't flinch nor try to jerk away now, as Brad tied a hackamore with the rope and slipped it over his head, and even though he wasn't broke to lead as Colonel had, he soon enough seen he was to follow the way that rope pulled him, as Brad got back on his horse and started for the ranch, for Red was riding close behind him, and with a flip of the end of his rope on his rump would keep him from pulling back. And so, as Colonel's return wasn't at all triumphant, nor proud while following shaggy and weak cattle to the ranch, neither was Charo's, for he was being taken back like a prisoner, an outlaw, one rider ahead and pulling him with a rope, and another behind to see that he didn't hang back on that rope. It was slow traveling, and late that night when the two riders pulled into the ranch with their prisoner, and put him in the same box stall with the now well-fed and good-feeling Colonel, that long-legged partner of his, and being with him again was the only thing that sort of helped at that time once again in captivity. When the next morning come and Virginia was told there was another parcel wrapped in horsehide for her at the stable, that it didn't look so much like a hat rack as the first one had, and so on, it again didn't take her long to guess what that parcel was, nor getting down to the stable to see it. Charo recognized Virginia as quick as Colonel had, and now was as gentle as he'd been wild only the morning before. Once tamed, a wild horse seldom ever forgets, and even though he might get away and run wild again, the catching of 'em is the hardest, harder than catching one that has never been caught or tamed. But once caught, again he'll soon come back to all that's been taught him in the taming. But he'll always get away every chance he gets, if kept near the country where he was raised and caught. There's no breaking him from that natural instinct. It was the same with Charo. He didn't grieve so much at being caught, and being kept closed in again, not near as much as a full-grown wild one would, for sometimes some of them are so broken-hearted they won't eat while inside an enclosure and will finally die. With Charo having spent his first winter in the stable, and corrals made it some easier for him this second time, and with the company of Colonel, and no humans to fear now that there was no freedom to watch out and run for so's to keep, he sort of made the best of it, and especially that it was winter, cold and stormy, the good hay, warm shelter, and water was sort of welcome for that time, only not to be able to go where and when he pleased, to be faced by heavy log walls and corral bars wherever he turned was like being in prison. That sort of chafed, sometimes more than it had that first winter, for now he'd had a good taste of freedom that was inborn in him, and he couldn't come to realize that such wasn't to be no more. But still, being mighty young, not yet a year and a half old, getting the best of care and feeling mighty good, he'd at times forget his being in captivity and go to playing with Colonel in the big corral in near the same same way as that thoroughbred would. Also to following Virginia around again the same as he had the winter before, when she'd come to visit, feed, or water 'em. The winter wore on that way, kinda slow for Charo, but being it was so furious and steady with wind, cold and snow, he took to the barred enclosures, warm shelter and good hay, with a near contented feeling, but an opened gate, even during the worst of the weather, would have been more than welcomed. He'd again been quick to hit out, been harder than ever to find or get near, and it would again took a rope to bring him back. With the coming of spring there was more and more the restless feeling of roaming with him. He'd got to walking around and around the big corral like a lion in a cage, stopped to gaze at the greening hills once in a while, at the distant Badland ridges, and all around, and wouldn't eat much. There was no more play in him by then, and when the much contented and good-feeling thoroughbred would sometimes tear loose into one of them spells, he seemed to hardly notice him, and would only put his ears back or kick at him when Colonel would nip at him, in trying to get him to play too. He was in no mood for any such nonsense. Virginia got to noticing that, and more too was that he wouldn't come near, nor follow her around like he had, and when Colonel would come to her as usual, he'd go to staying by himself, or just walking around the corral and looking outside it, hardly seeming to notice her or Colonel, as Brad would again sometimes come to the corrals to visit with Virginia of evenings, talking about the colts and things in general. He also got to noticing Charo's restless acting. "That little feller is getting poor too," he once said as he watched him pacing back and forth in the corral. "He ought to be picking up instead, with all the good feed you've been giving him the past months. Maybe he will when I turn him and Colonel out in the pasture, Virginia said. I think he has the spring fever, she laughed, and it's green grass he wants. More than that, grinned Brad. It's them faraway hills he's hankerin' for, his freedom, and if I was you, I'd be sure to add on a pole all around the top of the whole pasture fence before he's turned in there, or he might make a break of it. Virginia also thought that would be a wise thing to do, and when she told her dad, he at first didn't see no sense of going to the trouble of topping the pasture fence with a pole all around, not for only a little wild horse when he already had so many well-bred ones. Why don't you just let the poor devil go, he said. He don't want to be cooped up in no pasture anyway, but he's young and might get over that. Besides, Colonel would sure miss him, and if I turned the two out together and Charo broke away, Colonel would be sure to follow. All right, Cal had finally grunted. I don't know which one is most trouble, that spindle-legged thoroughbred or the sawed-off wild one. Anyway, and within a couple of days, a string of peeled lodge pine poles was strung and pegged along the top of the pasture fence, making it not only for a good-looking fence, but a hard one to get through and over. It was 5 foot high, and a fox-hunting horse could have easily cleared it if in mind to, but not Charo, not unless he was crowded, and then he'd be more apt to go through it instead, but there'd be no crowding him, and when him and Colonel was turned out in that pasture, it looked like it would sure enough hold him, if the gate was kept closed. Virginia asked her dad to warn all the ranch help as to that. Charo again took the lead out of the corral into the pasture, and the first place he'd hit for on a high lope was the gate at the other end, and where he'd got out the summer before, but it was of course very well closed, and then satisfied of that, and sizing up the fence with top pole all around, he went to nibbling at the green grass. That helped ease him some, and now he sort of felt he'd have to be contented and make the best of it, in the second best and closest he'd get to freedom, at least until there'd come another opening which he'd always be on the lookout for. With the few saddle horses in the same pasture, Charo got to losing his restlessness as he grazed along with them and Colonel. As the days went by and there was no sign of his wanting to break out and begin to rounding out in good shape again, Virginia, then satisfied, decided it was a good time to start to work on some plans she had for Colonel. That was to train and break him to saddle. Colonel was now a 2-year-old. Her dad had told her that thoroughbreds was started in training and rode some when much younger than that, and being Colonel looked so fit, had shed off slick, was fat as his kind could get, and now as tall as the grown saddle horses he was with. It was high time something should be done with him or started. But what to do with him, what to start him at, and for what purpose, sort of had Virginia stumped. She didn't want and had no use for no ordinary fancy or gaited riding horse. No matter how pretty or easy riding he might be, she didn't know anything about race horses or how to train one. She didn't have any use for such either, and so it came about that as Brad and her was in the pasture and looking at him one evening, she asked him on the subject. She still carried the feeling that Colonel was partly his, for even though he'd given her a clear bill of sale of him, she'd still felt that way. Then, when she'd lost him, and after near giving up all hope of ever seeing him again, Brad had found him and brought him back to her. Anyway, she wanted his advice, and felt he sure deserved some say as to what should be done with him. But Brad didn't feel that way, and was on guard the minute she started on the subject, for remembering how she'd felt the spring before, how the colt wasn't all hers, and the discussions there'd been over that. He was very careful and neutral, so that wouldn't repeat as the subject came up. Well, he says, as he got the drift of what she wanted of him, I wouldn't know just what to suggest. He's your horse, you know, and you better do with him as you see fit, your own self. If I was to suggest anything, it'd most likely be wrong in the long run, and that wouldn't do. Virginia was set back quite a bit at the kind of refusal, and she could tell right away what had caused it. She appreciated it in a way, and then again she felt hurt that he wouldn't have nothing to say or do with the training of the colt. He'd helped her with her other horses when she'd started breaking, even topped 'em off for her when there was too much buck in 'em. But with this thoroughbred it was different, and a kind of touchy proposition, like as any good intentions might turn to harm, and he figured it best to let well enough alone. The talk came to an end sort of sudden on the subject. The two was silent for a spell, looking at the colt but hardly seeing him. Then, with a queer little smile and some kind of remark that she had to help Anne at something or other, Virginia started back for the house. There was a kind of a queer grin on Brad's face, too, as he watched her walk away, and then looking at Colonel again, he rubbed the colt's knowledge bump a bit, and he said to himself as much as to him, "It'll be all right, old boy, I hope." Chapter 10. Saddle and Branding Iron. As the spring works was now in full swing, and Cal and his riders was away on the outskirts of the Hippo Range, for many days at a time, it was near a week before Brad returned to the ranch, since that evening when him and Virginia has had that cool little tiff over Colonel, and it was Red who'd first spotted some results of that, for pinned to the log wall and by Brad's bunk was the bill of sale he'd made to Virginia for Colonel, and on the same sheet by her own writing was added on, "I thank you, but I don't want him." It was signed Virginia. With Red's laughing at the plain in sight sheet of writing, Brad was soon by his side, and after reading Virginia's added-on writing he laughed too, but very little. Red soon quit laughing too, but not before he had to remark how Colonel now seemed to be an unwanted colt, saying that if nobody wanted him he'd sure like to have him. Brad didn't seem to hear him. Virginia didn't come down to the pasture that evening. That night he added on a few words to her writing and would give it to Anne to give her before he'd start out for another day's ride early the next morning. Brad's writing was short and to the effect that he wouldn't want the colt either, not now, that he was still all hers as far as he was concerned, and to do with it as she seen fit. There was no answer to that, and the bill of sale with the added writing wasn't returned again, but Virginia wasn't seen down the pasture with the colt of evenings no more either, at least not while Brad was at the ranch, and it wasn't until some time later, as Brad and Red and Jim run in the rodeo stock and made ready to hit out for the first rodeo of the year, that she sort of came out of her hiding and told Brad how ashamed she was for the way she'd acted, and that she'd again take care of the Colonel as usual while he was gone, but not a word did she say about the bill of sale or her feelings as to the colt being hers, nor of Brad refusing to have any say about him. But taking a chance and thinking it would make her happy, he told her to go ahead and start riding him, that he might surprise her and maybe take to working cattle better than might be expected. If he didn't, he would maybe suggest another scheme, if she wished. Brad had sort of given in with this little show of interest in the colt's training, but he figured if it done any harm, it wouldn't be no worse than if it had been, since he'd refused to have a word to say on the subject. As it was, Virginia was glad to again take heart with some plans for the colt. Of course, what Brad had said to start and try him out at range work wasn't much of a lead to go by, but the scheme he spoke of, if that didn't do, was what appealed to her. In the meantime, she would start riding him and see how he would take to a little range work. Brad and the other cowboys was no more than gone with the bucking stock one early morning when Virginia was down in the pasture, walked part ways as Colonel came to meet her, and putting a rope around his neck, led him up to the corrals and stables. Charo looked on, kind of wondering, and followed for a ways, but when nearing the corral gate he stopped, nickered once at Colonel, as Colonel was led in the stable, and then went back to join the saddle horses he'd been grazing with. He'd sort of figured there was something up that wouldn't be to his liking. Virginia was some surprised that the little Grula wouldn't follow. She wanted him in too to keep Colonel company and from getting nervous. So she seen where she just had to go out and get him. But it took a pan of grain before he'd let her walk up to him and put a rope around his neck, for he was no more the little Charo of the winter before, all independent and not caring no more for human favors nor company. But Colonel, he was still the same as ever before, kind and gentle, and as always welcoming the sound of human voice or touch of hand. There'd be no breaking of him to riding, or for anything else wanted of him to be done. It would all be only training and plain teaching, no bucking or fighting to get out of his system, and no treacherous tricks for the rider to watch out for. Not for the time anyway, nor never. Unless he was aggravated into developing a mean streak, as sometimes is with some thoroughbreds. If there'd been any danger or doubt as to Colonel's behavior, Brad would have wanted to ride him for at least the first few saddlings, but he knew from that colt's action that slipping a saddle on his back wouldn't scare nor faze him no more than when the horse blanket had been strapped on him in the boxcar and when trailed into the ranch from the railroad, and a rider slipping up in the saddle afterwards, especially Virginia, wouldn't spook him any nor make him want to act up. He wasn't built that way, and whether Virginia would be on his back or on the ground beside him would be all the same to his nature. Another thing was, Virginia was a mighty fair hand with range-bred horses, and her string couldn't be classed as what goes for ladies' saddle stock. She'd broke quite a few of them herself, and even though she didn't profess to be a bronco buster, she could hold her own with some mighty spooky ones. She had no fear nor thought but what she could easy handle Colonel, no matter what he might get in his head to do. But she was easy with him, took much more time and pains that any of the range-bred colts she'd broke. She at first gave him a good brushing, and sort of slicked him all up. Then she slipped her saddle on him in an easy a way, as though he'd been saddled many times before, and he didn't even bat an eye. It was a very different and some heavier saddle than his breed ever gets to see, but it felt and sat well on his back, and he didn't seem to mind if there none at all. He just sniffed at the stirrups hanging down on each side of him, then nosed the girl, as much as to say, "Well, what now?" The bridle came next over the hackamore that was already on his head. It was of a light head stall and snaffle bit. The bit was the only thing that bothered him so far, and he tried to work it out with his tongue, but of course with no luck. And being it didn't hurt, he'd soon enough get used to it. That all done, she tied up the hackamore rope and bridle reins to the saddle horn, giving him plenty of freedom, and still tight enough so as not to slip a foot into 'em in case he put his head down. Then he was left loose in the big corral to figure and get used to the rigging and bridle by himself. Colonel made a pretty picture going around the corral with the outfit on him, but Charo was more in wondering at his long-legged partner packing such a rig without making a fuss, and as though he'd done it all his life. With him, he'd been sort of scared of such a contraption a-setting on it, bucking it off or get out from under it in some way or other. He didn't follow Colonel around the corral then, and if he started to come near, he'd get out of his way. Virginia left Colonel be until he got used to the bit some and to packing the saddle. Then, when he stopped, like as if there'd been enough of the first lesson, she walked to him, unloosened the rope and reins, led him into the stable, and unsaddled him. Then she gave him a handful of crushed grain, and turned him loose, to roll and think over that first lesson. Charo was handed a handful of grain, too, and then the two was turned out in the pasture again. The proceedings was about the same on the next day, only not so long, with just packing saddle and bridle, for then Virginia also eased herself into the saddle, and now Colonel was some more interested, but not at all flustered at the girl. A-sitting up there in the middle of him and her 110 pounds didn't faze him no more than the 35-pound saddle had. He stood still for a few seconds, like just wondering what to do, and then she pulled on one bridle rein, turning his head, and with a light slap of the end of the reins on the opposite side, he moved the direction his head had been turned. She then turned him on the other side, both sides that way a few times, then straight ahead or just around the corral. In half an hour of working him easy that way, she had him go, turn, and stop whichever way she wanted him, without much trouble. Then she got off him and let him stand for a spell, and when she got on him again, she now broke him into a trot, to in time turn him one side, then the other, without slowing him down on the gait. Stopping and making him go as she wanted would take the longest to have him do really well, but the colt was cool-headed, and that would come in good time. After trotting him around the corral some, turning him, stopping him, getting off and on him time and again, and his behaving so well all the way through, Virginia was very satisfied with that second day's workout. She was pleased with the way he seemed so willing and anxious to learn whatever she wanted to teach him, and with his being that way it wouldn't have went well to try to teach him too many things at once. That would be apt to confuse and excite him so as to fretting, then he wouldn't be learning any more. Too long a times at first saddlings are no good either, for when getting tired the colt will lose interest and is apt to go to sulking and maybe try some tricks. Then he won't learn nothing to the good. Virginia didn't work on Colonel for much more than an hour that second day, and after another good brushing, which he liked, along with another handful of grain and no more, he was turned out in the pasture with Charo again. Charo didn't like such mysterious goings-on, for he sort of feared he might be next most any time, and that wouldn't go well with him. But he didn't need have no fear, because colts are not broken to ride or work on the range before they're 3 years old, and most of the time at 4 or 5 and on up. So Charo, not being of the racehorse type, still had some years to go before saddle leather would touch him. Maybe many if he ever got away again. Colonel, not having showed any signs of bullheadedness or foolishness at the first 2 saddlings, was rode outside of the corral for the 3rd time, a time when most range broncs are apt to bust loose at something or other on account of the feeling of more freedom in the open, and to do as they felt inclined. But it was all the same with Colonel, and he was as easy to handle outside of the corral as in. Even easier, for there was more room, less stopping and turning, and more interesting with Virginia on his back, and sometimes talking to him. With the openness of the country ahead and all around him, he felt of near the same freedom as he had when drifting along with Charo, only now somehow more at ease and secure with the close company of the human like part of him. That ride was only a short one, and was so enjoyed by both the girl and the horse that there was none of its being done inside the corral no more. The colt's training went on outside from then on, and for 2 or 3 hours every day or so, and the riding wasn't all plain poking or trotting along roads, for there was also cattle not so far from the ranch, some that as before would need Virginia's checking up on most every day, and winding around and looking through the bunches, sometimes having to hit on a high lope so's to get a close look at some wilder one, would all be variety that went well with the high-geared colt. He liked them cattle that would give him a little run, but it was hard for him to get it into his head to stop and turn when a fast-running critter was passed, and there Virginia was careful in stopping and turning him so he wouldn't get to fighting his head, jerking it sideways and up and down. She handled him with the hackamore then, most of the time using the bit very little. She wanted the colt to dodge with or against the critter, pass and turn, or if needed be, or whatever was wanted done with the horned one, as her good cow horses would do. It had taken her plenty of time and hard work amongst stock to teach them good cow horses of hers what all they knew, but they'd been of that breed get to taking as much interest in handling cattle as the rider did. Colonel was plenty intelligent, very willing and cool-headed enough, and even though Virginia had got him interested with cow work, and he would perk an ear at the ornery critter, he didn't develop much heart in the handling of 'em. It didn't seem to be in him, didn't have the knack, and after a couple of months of handling of 'em, a couple of hours or so most every day, he hadn't took to or learned as much as her cow horses had in their first week of breaking. He was about the same way with neck reining, where the horse is teached to turn by the touch of the rein on the side of his neck. A touch and pull of the rein on the left side turns him to the right, and the same on the right side turns him to the left. All fast-turning horses like the cow horse and polo pony are trained to that, and at all riding where the rider uses only one hand on the reins. Like with the cowboy, he has to have a free hand, especially while roping, one to hold the coils along with the reins and the other to throw the loop. Also, with the polo player, he has to have one free arm and hand to use his mallet. Colonel was a little limber-necked at neck-reining, that is, he'd learned to turn his head and neck the direction he was wanted to plenty easy, but his body wouldn't turn with it so well nor so quick. He done much better when both hands was used on the reins, like with a buggy horse, academy, or race horse, for that seemed to steady him more especially in a lope or run. Virginia handled him that way at the first couple of saddlings. Like with all colts, when first started, then she of course started to neck-reining him. More and more, while handling cattle, where a colt learns that the quickest, but he didn't answer to that very well even then. She tried both hackamore and snaffle reins, but neither seemed to work any better, and even though he done fair enough for the time he'd been rode, she didn't think he'd ever be what's called a well-reined horse. But maybe he'd come to it, she hoped. Maybe just take more time. There was one good thing sure, though, and that's how quick he could catch up to a bunch quitter, even without trying to run, and what a calf roping horse he'd make. For rodeos, if he could be teached to stop and keep the rope tight after the calf was caught and the rider had slid off the saddle to tie it down. Virginia had shook a loop off of him a few times, and Colonel showed only very little interest, no fear, and that had no meaning to him. Then one day, while her dad was riding along with her, some interested in Colonel's progress, and coming to a good-sized fall calf in one of the herds, he told her to dab her rope on that one and see how the colt would act. "All right," Virginia laughed, shaking out a loop, "but you'll have to heel it, roping the calf by the hind feet, because I don't believe I can bust the calf to lay. Colonel can't be handled well enough for that as yet." The big, strong calf lit into a run soon as he seen he was singled out, and Colonel, sensing that with the loop in Virginia's hand there'd be some new game to play and the calf would have some part in it, lit after him as she wanted to, like a streak, so much like a streak that the calf was caught up too, and passed before she could make a fair aim with her loop. The calf then dodged back behind the horse, and was safe in the middle of the herd again by the time she got Colonel stopped and turned. Cal shook his head and laughed. "Good thing you didn't catch that calf," he says, "because if you had, at the speed you went by him, you might have jerked his head plumb off his shoulders. But let's try it again." And so saying, he rode into the herd, maneuvered through it until his chance come, and then spurted onto the calf to cut him out in good speed again. Virginia, outside of the herd and with loop ready, set Colonel after the calf once more at the same speed, and even though the calf had a good start and going mighty fast, as such calves can, he was caught up to within the same distance as the head start he'd had. In other words, Colonel had been twice as fast, and that's going some, as any cowboy will vouch. And this time Virginia had been prepared. Her loop speeded to reach over the calf's head and draw up around the neck, just before Colonel had passed him, and now was the question to hold and keep the colt from passing. but no chance too much speed, and which only the horse himself can check up on at the right time when trained to roping. Colonel wasn't, and at the speed he was going there was no checking him up, not until he hit the end of the rope, and then the heavy calf at the other end done the checking up, near jerking Colonel over backwards. Colonel hadn't of course expected any such a jerk. Maybe he would the next time, but anyhow that slowed him down, sudden, and so that as he got his balance again, Virginia turned him and made him face the tight rope and the husky calf, now flat on his side at the other end. That calf had took quite some tumble, but had only the wind knocked out of him, as he landed so hard. It's mighty near impossible to hurt one of them 6 or 8 month-old range calves, raised by their mother's side and milk, no skimmed milk, and all the hay and grass they can eat. A jump off a 30-foot bank would hardly faze 'em. Knowing that, Colonel hadn't as yet got wise to a rope and hold it tight. Cal had rode onto the calf at near the same time. Virginia had turned her loose, and as soon as the rope slackened, he was off his saddle and took the rope off before that young one got his wind and could get up, and not any too soon, for the calf scrambled up as the rope grazed off his nose, and now, being on the pack fight, he butted the laughing Cal back up on his horse before he went back for the herd. "Thought you said you couldn't bust that calf to lay," Cal laughed on as he rode up to the side of Virginia again. "Well," she laughed back, "it wasn't my fault, and it's a wonder Colonel didn't get jerked down too. A good yearling would have done it," says Cal, "and a grown steer would have broke him in two, but a few more jerks like that with that calf for a starter will make him pay attention, and that's plenty heavy enough for him. If he could be made to stop soon as the calf is caught, he'd sure be a top one with that speed of his. But I guess it ain't in him to stop at such a time, because I see he can't stand to have anything be ahead of him, not when there's any running to be done. Maybe Brad could break him of that, teach him when and how to stop. Maybe one summer of rodeo calf roping would do it." Cal looked at his daughter in surprise. "Would you let Brad have him that way?" he asked. "Well," she shrugged, "maybe I would. I can't help but always feel that he's as much as his as mine, and if he'd be of good use to him that way, why—" "Ha, Cal grunted. "But he'd have to be trained a considerable out here before he'd be much good in a rodeo arena, and even then I doubt if he'd take to it. That's not in his line of breeding." Such an idea or thought was of course mostly only talk, and then, like out of the clear sky, there comes something else to Cal's mind. "You know, Virginia," he says, I got to thinking that this colt you're riding is a very valuable horse, valuable for his speed, more so to others that way than he might ever be to you. And what if he should ever get away again?" "What do you mean, Dad?" she asked, puzzled. "Just this, he ought to be branded." Virginia thought on that for a spell, then she said, "But I don't see where it's necessary for him to be branded. Not on this range, and where everybody knows of him. Besides, if anybody else got him, we could always identify him and prove he's ours." "Why, Virginia," Cal says, grinning at her, "I'm surprised at you talking that way, when you know better, and doggone well that it don't matter what kind of a horse he might be. The brand is the only thing that really identifies him. It's registered, and before 6 months old, every colt or calf should bear the brand of their owners on their hide, or they might come up missing with some other's brand on 'em, whether they was on this range or not, and nothing can be done about it unless it can be proved that the colt or calf was by their mother's side and taken away from them before being branded. That's impossible to prove after a couple of weeks' time. With this colt, whether he's found on or off this range, he'd be some great temptation for any rider who'd happen to see him. And then, supposing he got out where Mustang runners got a hold of him, they wouldn't know who he belonged to, and he'd be shipped out of the country with other Mustangs. You could of course claim him if you was there, and you had a couple of witnesses to prove he's yours, but you would never know he was caught or shipped, nor where he'd went to. But with your brand on him, that makes it all very different. It would then be plain horse stealing against anybody trying to run off with him. With the registered brand in state and inspectors' books, he can be traced and identified anywheres. Another thing is, he gets away and he gets caught. All the finder would have to do is look up the brand book, and the brand of the horse there would give him the name and address of his owner. No matter how good a description might be given of an animal as to color, age, size, or markings, that don't get anywhere, nor is paid attention to once far enough away. The brand is what counts and makes any man more than hesitate to move on with him, unless that man is a horse thief, and then he's taking big chances and liable to suffer plenty of consequences. Like an old cow thief I once knew often used to say, "I'll take to beef cattle every time, but no horses for me, because cattle soon go to the slaughterhouse, and that's the end of 'em. But with a horse, he'll live a long time, and always advertising the brand that might sooner or later give you away. Of course, some brands can be changed, but the changer has to be quite an artist to do that so well as to get by a good stock inspector." Virginia finally had to interrupt. "I know all of that fairly well, Dad," she said, "and I still don't see where it's necessary. That colonel should be branded. His kind is not supposed to be. Besides, I won't ever want to turn him out on the range. And now that the blacksmith has put that foolproof latch, as he calls it, on the new pole gates of the pasture, I don't see how he can ever get away again." Cal only shrugged and grinned a little. "All right," he says, "but if he was mine, there'd be my brand on him before sundown come this evening. His kind may not be supposed to be branded, but I used to have many of his kind, and by japers, every one of them I kept on the ranch here sure was branded. It sure didn't interfere with their good speed either. Made me feel like they was sure enough mine, while I owned 'em, and also proud of them packing my iron, because the most of 'em I raised here turned out to be winners. Of course, it's very different in some states, where there's no brand laws, and a brand is looked at only as a blemish, and true enough, it'd be only unnecessary and foolish to brand a horse there, because in such states the horses don't run free and mix with others as ours do on the range here, where they can go as they please for 100 miles, or more in some places. So being all horses should be branded in this territory, any unbranded one that gets away is apt to be anybody's for the taking, anybody who puts his brand on him first. That ain't a good feeling to have about a horse of your own, just on account he ain't branded, especially when you think a lot of him. No siree, and if I was you, Virginia, I'd sure slap my iron on this colt of yours right quick. I'd feel better about it if I was you." Virginia couldn't help but smile some at the concern her dad was showing over the colt. "You seem to have taken quite a sudden interest in Colonel," she says. "May I ask what caused that?" "I don't give a hoot so much about the colt," he came back at the girl sort of quick. "It's you I'm thinking of, the way you fretted, moped, and carried on the time he got away. And if that was ever to happen again, you might not be so lucky in getting him back. You'd have many more chances at that if you had your brand on him. And I know that for your sake I wouldn't be near so fretful myself then. I'll tell you what, Virginia, queer, I didn't think of it before, but you could use your mother's iron. It's a mighty neat little horse brand, goes on the left shoulder, and has been by her on as good as there could be in horse flesh. It's easy to read and couldn't be changed, so the original wouldn't show. We called it the Comet, just a star with tails like this." He traced it on the palm of his hand as he rode. "By the way, there was a breed of horses, and there's still trace of their blood can be found now and again. Your mother would be mighty pleased of you using her brand, and it would please me too." The two had been on their way back to the ranch, as that talk had been going on, and after a lull in the conversation, Virginia turned to her dad, saying, "I guess you win again, as usual, Dad. But what about Charo? Are we going to brand him too?" "Why, yes, I think we just as well while we are at it. But if you have no objections, I think I'll put one of my own horse irons on him. It would be better known than your mother's, which we'll put on Colonel." Virginia had no objections as to what iron was put on Charo, and as she said, he wasn't hers but Brad's, or her dad's mostly, so that's how come that being the branding was now decided on, that same evening would be as good a time as any to do and have it over with. On their return to the ranch, while Virginia rode into the pasture to get Charo, Cal got busy building a branding fire in one corner of the corral, then digging up his wife's branding iron, which had been carefully put away and hadn't been used for over 20 years. He laid it on the fire to once more be heated. One of his own old ones was laid alongside of it for Charo. It was the C for G for Cal Goodwin, the branding of a gentle horse, one that can be led to stand without fighting, is a simple operation and doesn't last long. The gentle horse is just held, doesn't have to be thrown or even hobbled, and by the man holding him putting a hand over one eye on the side he's to be branded, or blindfolded. Few horses will seldom move a hoof or more than flinch as the hot iron is placed on their hide by the other man. It's only for a few seconds, and after it's done the horse might only do a little twitching at the seared part, then go right back to grazing soon as he's turned free again. Not at all the worse for the experience, and seeming to hold no fear nor grudge against the human for it. But of course, after all, a brand is a burn, and as Cal had said, would be very foolish and unnecessary to do in some countries. But on the western ranges, where stockmen run up to many thousand head of stock, it's very necessary to brand, even to the gentlest close to the ranch. No stockman has any time to do anything that's unnecessary, much less cause pain to any of his stock, even if only for a few seconds, such a branding, if it wasn't absolutely necessary. Virginia held the horses while Cal done the branding. Neither Colonel nor Charo made any fuss, as the red-hot iron seemed to only touch their hide. After that was over, some heavy healing salve of Cal's own mixture that would also keep flies away was spread thick on the fresh-made brands, and the 2 was left to go to the pasture, marked for life and protected from any rider who before would have figured the colts as easy pickings, and very much worth getting, especially the tall dark one. So now, no matter where these 2 would graze or range, the well-known brands they was packing would be recognized and respected. They wasn't nobody's horses no more, and Virginia did feel some better about the brand of ownership on Colonel's shiny left shoulder, her mother's brand, and now proud it was her very own.